Davidson.
E te māngai o te whare, tēnā koe, huri rauna I te whare, tēnā koutou katoa. It is with some frustration that I rise to speak on behalf of the Green Party. We oppose this second reading of the Social Housing Reform Transaction Mandate Bill. This bill is purely to enable a flog-off of public housing assets, and at a time when we need more. And over the time of this government, the public housing, the state housing stock has shrunk indeed. E te māngai, in New Zealand in 2016, we have a severe housing crisis, and this bill is not driving to fix it. It is not. And it is important to call this government out in not wanting to address the severe housing crisis. While we often hear of the crisis of housing affordability in Auckland, with prices blowing out every day, that is not the extent of our problems. There is also a crisis in the quality of housing, and certainly government has not been a responsible landlord. As spokesperson for social housing, my office receives far too many messages from whānau, and I literally mean whānau, my whānau, across the country, living in both Housing New Zealand and private rental housing, who are desperately trying to get action on warming up and fixing their homes so that their whānau can live safely. We also know that there is a crisis in the levels of severe housing deprivation, also known as homelessness, and I do want to take the time to enforce that this bill is not driving to fix homelessness. And I think now of just in the past, year, maybe 6 months, particularly Māori women with children having to crowd into friends' garages, also Māori women with children, because they are unable to find a home either in the rental, most definitely in the rental market, both public, state provided, and private. And I'm thinking of them right now as I'm in this house as a Māori woman and understanding very clearly that this bill is not even wanting to pretend to want to help those very people. So I've learned about homelessness that it is very difficult to get any information, any solid information, any information at all, in fact, about what the government is doing, and the government refuses to measure and get data on it. However, we know from those working on this issue in the community that it's getting worse by the day. There is no national policy framework to address homelessness, no government agency or ministry responsible and accountable for homelessness, no welfare response, no housing response, let alone the whole of government approach that is required. The mind boggles as to how the government can simply ignore the disgraceful reality that increasing numbers of New Zealanders, including in my home community of South Auckland, are living in streets, in cars, in garages and charity shelters. It is a moral disgrace and a governance disgrace, and this bill certainly is not aiming to help that. So, e te māngai, when we know that there is a crisis in housing affordability, a crisis in the quality of rental homes, and a crisis in the levels of severe housing deprivation and homelessness, then we know the scale of our housing issues are massive. They require the urgent attention and commitment of this House, and this bill isn't it. But instead we have this bill. The lack of ambition and concrete solutions is striking, because it's not even trying to do that. But more than that, this bill has the potential to substantially undermine the provision of public housing in this country. What this bill is about is extending the government's pervasive privatisation agenda into the area of social housing and abdicating their responsibility to ensure New Zealanders have secure and healthy housing. The bill also puts extraordinary powers in the hands of ministers, cutting across the due process and accountabilities of the HNZC board. Extraordinarily, the government sees their own ministers, rather than Housing New Zealand, as being most qualified to manage the ownership of our $18 billion state housing assets. There are no constraints on who or what these assets are transferred to. They can and probably will be sold to overseas interests. The government claims they want to transfer these homes to New Zealand community housing organisations, but we know that the Salvation Army and other organisations have made it clear they're not in a position to buy these run-down homes which have been badly managed by Housing New Zealand, and renovating them is too big a cost to those community organisations. So we want to see more support for community housing organisations, yes, but not at the expense of state housing. And the driver for community housing should not be because the government is simply wanting to shirk off its core government responsibility. So yes, the Green Party understands that good community housing where organisations are able to step up is vital, and that this must sit alongside state housing as a core and vital infrastructure. So e te māngai, I myself have long-standing experience in the real impacts of this agenda, privatisation agenda, on our communities. I've tried to stay connected to the residents' campaign of the Glen Innes community, who resisted the sell-off of their state homes to the Tāmaki Redevelopment Company. Property developers are the group who will benefit from this bill, Mr. Speaker. The residents of Glen Innes have indeed been vindicated in their fight, in their arguments. Newly developed housing in Glen Innes is being sold for between $600,000 to $800,000. That is not affordable. Since this sell-off began, land values in Glen Innes have increased from $400,000 to over $800,000, $800,000. This is gentrification, Mr. Speaker, pure and simple. I am proud that the Green Party opposes this bill. Kia ora.